Last fall, I lived off campus with some strangers who also happened to be freshmen at Georgetown. Due to Georgetown's COVID closure, we didn't have spaces like libraries, dining halls, or gyms to build impromptu relationships. But there was one unlikely commonality shared amongst both my roommates and almost 800 of my Georgetown freshman peers. We were all taking Professor Burke's Principles of Microeconomics class. Within a few weeks of the start of the year, something magical started to happen. I started hearing the economics concepts we were learning in class being used in casual social conversations. This was particularly profound because in the absence of everything that normally brings Georgetown students together due to COVID, we coalesced around the only thing we really had in common, which was this class. I enjoyed these economics concepts so much that I became a teaching assistant for Professor Burke last fall, and thus had the opportunity to engage with these economic concepts outside the often restrictive bounds of tests and grades. It was only then that I fully understood how advantageous it is to make decisions in my own life as if I were an economist. So before you trust me and the economics with your major life decisions, let me walk you through some examples of how my peers and I would use them last fall to get you both acclimated with what these economic concepts mean and how they can be leveraged in your own life decision-making. These 4 economics concepts, which I've dubbed the economics of quitting, are a war chest of 4 simple yet profound microeconomic principles that you can leverage in your own life decision-making, especially when you face reoccurring and difficult questions, especially the often overwhelming, when should I quit? So, if we take it back to last fall, when my roommates and I were thinking, should we order in delivery or go get takeout, we would conduct a cost-benefit analysis like we'd learned in class. The cost-benefit principle is the notion that if the costs exceed the benefits, we should not do something. But if the benefits exceed or are equal to the costs, we should do it. So that cost-benefit analysis is merely asking, is it worth it or not to do something? This is nothing new, even if you aren't an economist. But our decision-making last fall would look a little something like this. What would the cost be and what would the benefits be of ordering in delivery? Well, those costs would be, if we were to order in delivery, we paid those delivery and service fees that wouldn't exist if we went and got takeout. And another major cost would be, we wouldn't have the opportunity to make friends, those other freshmen that are living in the neighborhood that would probably be at that restaurant and build a relationship with them. That's a huge cost. But then on the benefits side, because it's a rainy Friday night, we'd stay dry. We'd expend far less effort because someone else would bring the food to us. And because we're effectively buying back an hour of our time, we would have another hour to do homework or study. And because if we were just to go get takeout, we'd only have an opportunity to go maybe half a mile and however far we could walk in maybe 15 or 20 minutes. If we used a delivery app, we could have a delivery driver with a car go as far as a couple miles to get that food. But this is nothing new. This isn't economics. We need to introduce a new principle that allows us to make this decision a little bit easier. So we need to think, is it better or worse to do costs or benefits? What should we do? Should we go get delivery or should we order in? So we just discussed that this is the idea that if the costs don't exceed the benefits, we shouldn't do it. So what do we see here? We remember we took algebra. When the mouth of the greater or less than sign is facing something, whatever it's pointing towards is greater than what it's facing away from. And this made sense when we were doing algebra in 4th grade. It was a little bit more difficult in 6th grade when they added letters. But these are full bullet point sentences. How could you possibly decipher which is larger? We don't know, but the decision is yours. Only you as the economist can make that. So let's take it a step further and introduce another microeconomic principle that'll allow us to make that decision a little bit easier. This is the idea of framing. The idea of framing is that different people in different ways could say the same attributes of the same decision differently, and thus we'll think that the decision might be a little bit different than it is, even though this is merely the economic principle of framing. So if we look at the costs and benefits we just laid out for that delivery example, let's try to tease out if there's any framing going on in the costs and benefits we already laid out. Well, this is the idea that we could pay delivery and service fees. This is a huge cost. If I work at a grocery store, which I do, and I only make $15 an hour, an extra $10 on top of my $15 of food is tremendous. But this really only matters if it's our own money. But if this is our parents' money, this doesn't really matter. And if any of the students in the audience don't believe me here, ask your parents if they think that you spend their money differently than you would spend your own, and come back to me. This is because of another economic concept that we won't be discussing today. But if we continue on, if we lose the opportunity to meet these new freshmen that are in the neighborhood, this is a huge sacrifice. This is what I was complaining about. We don't have these spaces like dining halls, libraries, or gyms to build new relationships, so we should really take every opportunity given to us to meet these new freshmen. On the benefit side, we have this opportunity to save time and do homework because we're effectively buying back an hour of our time. But if we look at this with the dangers of framing in mind, we realize that there is not a chance we spend that extra hour on a Friday night doing anything productive. So we should effectively eliminate this benefit outright. If we continue on, we see these opportunities to stay dry and expend less effort. You know, as college students, we should really just put on a rain jacket and get our own food, so this really isn't a benefit we should be thinking about. But the idea of a wider restaurant selection, this isn't framed. This is pretty true. So we looked at our cost-benefit equation, we parsed it for the dangers of framing, but this is kind of a unidimensional question. What if we take on a question where we have two different opportunities with different sets of costs and benefits? Well, we had an example from last fall. The principle that we're gonna tie in here is this idea of opportunity cost. The opportunity cost of something is the cost of the next best alternative. So last fall, if we were invited to two parties, we would use the opportunity cost analysis to decide which party we should go to. So as I just mentioned, the opportunity cost is the value of the next best alternative. So the opportunity cost of party one is party two. And we know that we want to go to both of these parties because the benefits exceed the costs in both alternatives. But here's where the economics need to help us. Because the benefits exceed the costs in both of these alternatives, which party should we go to? Well, we could calculate the net benefit of both of these parties and see which is bigger, and that's what we just did. Because the net benefit of party one is greater than the net benefit of party two, we should go to party one. So if we continue on, we can, just as we parse the cost-benefit analysis with the dangers of framing, we're gonna parse the opportunity cost analysis with the sunk cost in mind. And the sunk cost fallacy is the notion that we tend to overestimate how important the extended costs and benefits that we already put into our decision when we're making our present cost-benefit analysis. So for example, it's our time, energy, or effort that we put into getting where we are now that we shouldn't take into account when we're deciding what our next step is. So if we're thinking about that example that we were just talking about, we have our house, which is where we are, and we were invited to two parties. Which party should we go to? We already know that we want to go to party one because the net benefit of party one is greater than the net benefit of party two. So if we're here in our Georgetown neighborhood, right on the banks of the Potomac, we have our two parties. Party one is northeast of us, party two is southeast of us, and because we know we want to go to party one, we expend 20 minutes and $20 on an Uber getting there. And for this, let's pretend it's our money and not our parents' money. And we're at party one, and maybe we're hearing from our friends at party two that party two might be better than we thought it were. Maybe the benefits far exceeding the costs. Maybe our cost-benefit equation was wrong about party one and it wasn't as fun as we thought. Even though this is a little bit of framing on the part of our peers at party two, we'll let them have it. And we're at party one and we're thinking, what is our next move? In that situation, what you do is you say, we spent 20 minutes and $20 on getting here. Maybe we'll stay another 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes, even though the benefits are no longer exceeding the costs. But what we need to do as economists is we need to disregard that sunk cost. And we need to only make our decision based on our current costs and benefits. So if we're deciding on going to party two or not, we should not think about that 20 minutes and $20 we just spent. We should make a new cost-benefit equation deciding whether or not to go to party two, stay at party one, or go home, irrespective of that 20 minutes and $20. So we discussed the cost-benefit analysis with that idea of delivery. We parsed it for the dangers of framing. We discussed this idea of opportunity cost with this new party example. And then we talked about how sunk costs get in the way of making our present cost-benefit calculations. Let's take this to a bigger example, an example that I faced 4 years ago as a sophomore in high school, where I decided the cost-benefit analysis that I conducted in 8th grade was no longer sound. I felt that I might want to transfer high schools and maybe in pursuit of seeking more benefits at a new high school. So let's go through the 4 principles of microeconomics and housed within the umbrella of the economics of quitting and see, although I didn't have these economics of quitting at the time, how they can help us make that decision. So if I was thinking about transferring high school, what would those costs be? Well, I'd lose all those teacher, student, and extracurricular relationships that I built over my first years of high school. I wouldn't have this opportunity to build 4-year-long professor relationships and then ask them for college recommendations. I wouldn't have the opportunity to see those peers in the hallways that I wouldn't maybe hang out with outside of school, but would see in the hallways. I would never see those people ever again. And then those students that even if I was really friends with, it would never be the same after I'd left them for another high school. And then those extracurricular positions that I fought for in clubs, I would lose them all, and I would start basically as a freshman but as a junior at this new high school. Then there could be a negative effect on my college options. What if I get to this new high school and the classes are much harder than I anticipated, but my peers have been practicing them for 2 years, so it was easy for them, but difficult for me? What if I was too worried about acclimating to this new high school that I wasn't able to focus on my classes and perform well? These are all examples of how this could have a tremendous negative effect on my college options. And then thirdly, I already made my parents go through the high school process once. I would surely annoy them if I were to go through it again. Then we'll look at the benefits. So the benefits would be if the culture fit at my new high school was really much better, I'd have the opportunity to build relationships in both the teacher, student, and extracurricular domains that were much stronger than anything I could have hoped for at my old high school. Then I'd have the opportunity to have a fresh start and implement all the maturing I did over my first 2 years at my old high school, but to create a newfound self that I wouldn't be able to do if I was still bogged down by the vestiges of my freshman and sophomore selves at my old high school. And then finally, if my calculations are correct, I'd become happier. And at the end of the day, this is the most important thing. So after we, with the delivery example, outlined our costs and benefits, we parsed it for the dangers of framing. So let's see what that would look like. What would be the framing of the costs and benefits I just outlined? Well, if I were to lose those student-teacher relationships at my old high school, that might pale into comparison the gravity of the relationships I can make if the culture fit at my new high school is really much stronger. This idea that it would also have a negative effect on my college options is kind of framing, because if I'm miserable at my current high school, this will have a negative effect on my college options as well. And then thirdly, this idea that it would annoy my parents. Well, if my parents do love me, and I've been told that they do, this should not matter. And then we discussed the idea of having the opportunity to build new relationships at a better culture fit, and this is certainly true. That's not framing. This idea that I could have a fresh start is such a valuable opportunity to mature in a way that my peers who stayed at the same high school for 4 years wouldn't have. And then also, as I mentioned, this idea of becoming happier cannot be understated. So as we just went through the 2 microeconomic principles that we leveraged with the delivery example, let's continue this on and weave it through the examples that we used with the party example. We remember the opportunity cost is the value of the next best alternative. So just like the opportunity cost of party 1 was party 2, the opportunity cost of high school 1 is high school 2. But in juxtaposition to that example with the parties, it appears that the costs and benefits do not check out with my first high school. It appears that the costs actually exceed the benefits, but it appears that the projected costs and benefits of my second high school are different. Thus, what is the next step? We need to parse out and see if any of the sunk costs in the last 3 steps are relevant. So we look at those costs and benefits that I already laid out. Are there any sunk costs? Yes. This idea that we would lose the teacher-student and extracurricular relationships is a huge sunk cost, because this is the energy that we already expended getting to point A where we are now, but we shouldn't take into account when we're deciding if we want to go to point B. So when we look at the economics of quitting, we look at the costs and benefits that we already laid out, we parse them for the dangers of framing, we looked at the opportunity costs with both of our examples, and then we tried to parse out the sunk costs in our equation. And it appears that because a lot of those costs are either framed or are sunk costs, they pale into comparison with the relevance of our benefits. So, because the benefits outweigh the costs of transferring high schools, the economics say I should do it. And that's exactly what I did. I didn't quit, but I merely reassessed the cost-benefit analysis that I did as a 8th grader, but then again as a sophomore in high school. And I realized that my priorities and cost benefits had changed. So what do the economics of quitting tell us? They tell us when we face a Herculean problem with a number of variables, we should first outline what our costs and benefits are. Then we should parse out what the framing is in those cost benefits that we just outlined. We should see what the opportunity cost is if we stay on our current path or if we decide to diverge. Then we should see if any of the previously laid pros and cons we laid out are sunk costs. And because the marginal benefit of another minute of me speaking here does not exceed the costs, I will end my talk here. Thank you very much.